Good morning. How's everybody doing? That sounds like folks need to hit the coffee bar in the back, but that's all right. The United Nations Secretary General just lamented that only 10% of speakers at the General Assembly are women. I think maybe he's in the wrong room. He has an open invitation to join us here. I'm really delighted to be on this panel with three fantastic women leaders working in the gender and climate space. My name is Michael Igoe. I'm a reporter with Devex on our news team, and it's wonderful to see you all here. Thanks for joining. I'll just do a very quick intro, and then we're going to jump right into our conversation. We have a lot to cover this morning. Yamide Dagnet is the Senior Vice President of International Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Olivia Leland is the founder and CEO of Co-Impact, and Kathy Baughman McLeod is the CEO of Climate Resilience for All. I encourage you to take a look at our speakers' bios because they really cover the full gamut of what climate action looks like in 2024 and what it needs to look like if we're going to get anywhere close to accomplishing critical climate goals. We'll start with a couple of questions for each of you, but I encourage you all to just jump in and keep this free-flowing. You've obviously circled around some of the same tables, the same COPs for years, and have built up really remarkable expertise on this question of how we really break down the barrier between gender equity and climate action, which is a barrier that needs to be broken down if climate solutions are going to be truly responsive to the people who are most affected by this enormous global challenge. Kathy, let me start with you to sort of put this in some concrete terms for us. You've been on a real mission to highlight the dangers of extreme heat and the particular danger that extreme heat poses to women around the world. I wonder if you could just sketch that out for us a little bit so that we're all sort of on the same page of why climate disruption is a gender equity issue, and what needs to happen to ensure that that particular dimension of the impacts of climate change is neither invisible nor normalized.
Thank you very much. Let me start with just one thing. You know, we are here at Climate Week. There are so many events and messages and panels, but just one thing. Women are the answer to every climate question. So I'm going to tell you a story about Geeta Ben. Geeta Ben is a head loader in the market in Ahmedabad, and her job is to move fabric on her head from one end of the market, from one client to the other. And on May 27th, it was 51 degrees C in Delhi, it was 46 in Ahmedabad. Because of Geeta Ben's low status, she is a member of the Self-Employed Women's Association and our partner. When she goes up and down the market, because of her low social status, she can't wait inside where there is a fan. And so she is waiting for her next load, standing out in the heat. And her client brings her the fabric, she puts it on her head, she steps off the curb, and she passes out from the heat. And she breaks her leg, and she has a head injury. And so she needs to go to the hospital for a cast and an IV. She has to take a loan for that because she can't afford it. And she's financially responsible for 50% of the value of what she's carrying. That's the deal with her client. So she has to take a loan to pay it back because it fell and it was soiled. And so she's now out of work for 3 weeks. And because she does not have a safe public toilet, she has to go outside, and she doesn't want to do that. None of them do. And so she restricts her water intake because it's not safe and dignified to go outside. So she gets urinary tract infections, and she is dehydrated, thus contributing to her passing out. Now she's in debt 3 ways and not working. She doesn't have enough for food. So we Climate Resilience for All in this partnership and with Swiss Re provided a micro-insurance and a cash social support layer that paid out because of that heat to support her income. She was able to eat for 10 days of the 3 weeks. She paid off the debts for the IV and the cast, and most of the debt for the fabric. I tell that story to just give a sense how tangible extreme heat is affecting women. And women are 4 times as more heat intolerant than men. And I could go on with the statistics, but when you want to help people understand how are women disproportionately affected, that was financial, that's cultural, that's physiological. And so women are disproportionately affected by heat, and the solutions are many. And again, women are the very best investment on ROI that we can make. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. I mean, that's a really powerful example. It occurs to me that you said the solutions are many, and in this case, thank goodness one was there to be provided and to provide some relief. The conditions and the context that give rise to that type of vulnerability are also many and are deeply rooted. So Yamide, let me turn to you. I mean, you've been involved in, I think I saw you at COPs probably 10 years ago, and you've been there much longer, involved in this much longer than I have. So you've had a front row seat to climate policy for a long time. I'm curious how you think about the bringing together the imperative to act quickly, which is an imperative that we're all very aware of at this point when it comes to climate change, with addressing or at least confronting some of these enormous gender inequity challenges that Kathy's alluding to that really speak to an almost sort of generational cultural change that's needed to reduce those vulnerabilities that exist. How do you think about such an enormous aspect of the problem that would seem to be slow and tectonic in the face of an emergency?
Thank you very much, and it's great to see so many people. And so I'm going to do 2 things in responding to your questions. I think we need to highlight definitely the issue, and another example is on migrations. I think there's 80% of the people forced to migrate due to climate change are women. And in doing that migration, they are more vulnerable to violence, unexpected pregnancy. So these are just, other social, dimension. But what is very important is to make sure that those women are represented and have a seat at the table when it comes to decision-making process. And we need to be vigilant. I want to give an example of where, when we heard that the COP29 presidency had a committee to advise, its agenda, all male, well, a group of women, the Dandelions, reacted. It's unacceptable. We exposed it also with the support of the media, and to really counterbalance and to make sure that in this committee there were women bringing their voices. In the
Here.
In the and then when you see that some women are very often invisible, you can imagine that when it comes to solutions, solutions that have an impact on them are not thought through. So we need to make sure that evidence are also, embedded into the women's story. So in the IPCC, for example, the most authoritative scientific institutions, in the 19th, there were only 10% representation of women. Now it's 30, but we need to do more. And we need to train, empower, and make sure that they're geographical balance, because you can imagine that within those 30, the Global South is not very much, represented. In the UNFCCC negotiations, we just reached, between 2008 and 2022, between 35%, we're still not where we need to be. So I'm just giving those statistics to really highlight that the fight continue, to represent, to bring the voice. And in addition to the example of how it affects us, we need to bring examples of how the women are the solutions. And I know I'm taking a little bit of time, but I want to build from what Kathy said. The Natural Resource Defense Council have been partnering for 10 years with SIWA, the same partner actually, and we set up a green village. Within that green village, and I had the opportunity to visit it in May this year, 47 degree. And I was just energized to see so many women fighting to tell the stories on how our work together changed their lives. So one example was how to invest into an electric tuk-tuk, those free wheels vehicles. She was explaining how it enabled her to avoid having to walk with the products that she was selling, and to cover 150 kilometers of market, how it expanded her market, how it made her more independent. And then you had the whole value chain within that green village, where you had the women owning the shop, where they were producing some fertilizers with their traditional tree, the neem tree, where they were actually trained to maintain the solar panels that were powering the irrigation system, or again having electric cooking instead of those with the wood that were creating health also problems. So I'm just giving you just a few examples on how some of the solutions on energy, bringing energy and resilience together, how they were having some paints on the roof to reduce heat. Some for them having an AC, air conditioning was too expensive, but there's more energy efficient ventilators, fans, and they were able to fix them. So you don't think about, okay, you make an investment, you get the product that you need. No, they didn't need to wait for another consultant to repair. And they created a value chain of entrepreneurs to make sure that they were not only self-employed, self-sustained. So I just wanted to give that example. Those women who were on fire, and this is really, you can see how I am getting animated, but I will never forget this. And this is really talking when I am in the negotiations, and even if it can be very daunting to go to Azerbaijan, there may not be a lot of civic space, or especially for our women. For this reason, I'm going, and I will have that picture, that experience in my head, to be able with RIMA, our partners, to really push the agenda forward.
Thanks, Yamide. Yeah, please. I think it's so important on this topic to have those bright spots to hold on to. As a reporter, I'm certainly prone to focusing on the problems a lot, and there are plenty to focus on. But thank you for sharing that. What energizes you and energizes you to travel to Baku in November. So the development community, the climate community, the development community, these are also not immune to some of these blind spots when it comes to the intersection of gender, equity, and climate change. And it seems to me that one of the places, or the ways in which those blind spots appear, is through this tendency to put everything into silos, right, Olivia, where we have climate change, we have gender. Folks here who work on other issues will be familiar with how those single issues tend to get broken out into their own silos and funded vertically, or sort of seen through a particular set of solutions. How are you seeing promising examples of breaking down those silos when it comes to gender and climate, and particularly on the funding side? Where the money really comes in a way that supports that intersection?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here and with this great panel. Great to join all of you. I guess I would start by saying that if you look not at the funding side, but actually at those that are really driving change, And we see this with Co-Impact, where we're supporting local organizations that are working to shift systems to make them more gender equitable, more inclusive, and more effective. We can see that actually those silos are not existing, right? That's where those that are really driving the change can see that if you're focusing on advancing gender equality and you're shifting systems, inevitably you will also be looking at climate. And so as we've found, as we're looking at, for us, it's about actually asking the partners what's needed. They are not seeing these silos, and actually for the women in the community who are working, they're not seeing things as, okay, this is something that fits here or there. And yet for some reason within funding, and you can see that even this week, I was actually talking to someone who had gone to a number of different events that were actually around climate and others that were around advancing gender equality. And the two groups are still quite siloed. So while we actually do have the bright spots of people trying to bring them together, and I'm really excited by that, I think what we're finding is that a lot more needs to happen. But I think the answer to that is actually by listening to those that are driving the change and saying, what do you need in terms of the support to be able to do what the other panelists here were talking about, which is actually putting women leaders at the forefront. And we often talk about how the climate crisis is affecting women and girls, but the conversation also needs to be about how women leaders need to be driving those conversations at every level, right? At everything that we're talking about. And so actually being able to put funding behind the very types of solutions that people are talking about here and not seeing it as one issue or another, but actually really looking at their cross-cutting. So I think that's something that hopefully will start to happen in rooms like this and otherwise. But I do think we still have a ways to go in terms of figuring out what that will take. And I know at Co-Impact, we're still learning. We're still figuring out what role we can play to be able to complement what others are doing across this. Because our core has been really advancing gender equality. And as we've been seeing so much from our partners saying, let's actually look at these intersections, we've been having many more of these conversations and saying, okay, how do we connect? How do we think about not just the outcomes around power and around agency, around economic outcomes, but also ecological outcomes? How do all of these things come together, and supporting the leaders who really have many of these answers and the bright spots that you're talking about?
Thanks, Olivia. And actually, I want to stay with you for a minute because you alluded to Co-Impact's mission around ensuring that women and global South-led organizations are at the center of climate action. And something that's striking about Co-Impact is your transparency around what you've learned trying to do that. Your website actually includes quite a lot of information about the experiences that you've had trying to fund these organizations, but not just fund them, invite them to the table in a meaningful way. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what you've learned in terms of what works and what doesn't when it comes to using resources from the global north to support organizations like that in the global south in a way that is absolutely critical to this fight. And I would invite Kathy and Yamide to weigh in on that as well, because I know it's not a one-woman job here.
So I think your last bit is actually probably what I would say is our biggest lesson, is that it's all about doing this in community. Because I do think that because none of us have we hopefully have some of the answers, but actually it's by coming together, that's actually how we can be more effective in what we can actually support. So I do think there's, for us, it's about, and as you've seen in play in the way that we have approached the work, it's about how do you really truly center the voices of those that are driving change in not just sort of in how you support, but or not just in like who you support, but actually how you support. So some of our lessons have been, how do we actually really center the partners? So things as kind of concrete as when you have a conversation saying, what is it that you want to be covering? What is it that you want to see from us as a funder? Rather than coming in, often in funders, we come with our ideas of what it should be, but actually really making sure that we do center the experiences and the voices of those that we're actually in existence for, right? So I think that's really key. I also think that, you said global north resources. Actually, very intentionally within Co-Impact, it's been global resources because we very much want it to be a global community. So both on the funding side, it's actually from around the world, and then also in terms of the support for the partners. And I think there is something to that. If what we're talking about here is what we're trying to change, it's about how do you make sure that you bring different perspectives together, and actually from that you can go further in what you're trying to do. So I think that's been a big lesson for us, is how do you kind of curate those sorts of spaces and communities to be able to realize that even us, right, we are a collaborative, but we also think about how do we collaborate with others in what we're doing, because ultimately, often you can end up in some of these spaces here where we'll say, okay, well, we need to work together. And then you leave and continue on with what our path is, right? And so it's actually like, how do we, afterwards, what is that next step? What's the next step after we have this discussion so that what we're doing adds up to more together?
If I could, yes. And for the nitty gritty of that, that's a short story about Gitaben, but the product that we developed was developed with the women. And so grassroots leaders representing women by trade. And so roundtables and focus groups to figure out what the product needed to do, fed back through grassroots leaders into the conversation we had with the Swiss Re product developers and with us and medical doctors representing Self-Employed Women's Association. And the reason I'm saying it is that it takes time, and there's an urgency to this work, and yet we have to have the inclusivity. You have to ask, and it needs to be driven from the women, from what is it that you need. And you just said it, but just thinking about the chain of what it takes time, but also that ultimately we want the replication and the scale. We need that to be mainstream, that the motivation, the contours of a product, the scope of combined financial and non-financial and other interventions that are going to be investing in livelihoods, which I would say, Yamide, yes and yes and yes on the investment in new ways to self-sustain, to grow, to make more money, and to we're thinking about the members as the new insurance agents that sell insurance to their community as more of this type of insurance is scaled. But it starts with women and asking and the inclusivity, and it takes a little bit more time than we're accustomed to, but what we're doing right now is not working so well. So I think the time is important.
Yes, and I think I worked in the government, then as an activist in the think tank, then had a stint in the philanthropic world, and now back into the field. As in a think tank, coming back, I think that I see a lot of fragmentation in our efforts, and this is why in your first question, I made a point to really build up and to demonstrate that together we can go so much further. Because what Kathy and her organization is bringing is complementary to what we're bringing with the same. SIWA, self-employed women associations, and it's about scale ultimately. So I just wanted to make a plea, as we're trying to navigate 900 events, but how we can do a little bit more together, first of all, and that can help also the funders, to try to navigate how their funding is going to add up and or be more than the sum of the parts. The other plea for the funders community is to make sure that there's more trust into the system. We are at an implementation time. So what is very, very often needed to really make a reality what you beautifully described is co-funding, unrestricted co-funding to those communities. Instead of saying, yes, I want that money to really do that particular project or thing, spending time with those beneficiaries and then trust them and give them the flexibility to use the money how they think is best. and in a resilient way, because they would have to navigate also some of the changing climate and changing opportunities. So I think that, and also invest for the long term. I think building on what Kathy said, for too long there's been piecemeal, funding for just 1 year. We need more than 3 years. And the opposition is winning because, what we see now is because they made investment for more than 10 years. We're seeing, whether it's disinformation or it's been long in the making, actually. We are struggling now, but so we need to tackle the urgency, but in a sustainable way to also see long term. And investment is important. And my last point is to really challenge some perceptions about what is possible, especially by women. I would like to remind everybody, you can check some of the statistics, but the highest proportion of entrepreneurs, the highest proportion of women entrepreneurs in the world is in Africa. A quarter of entrepreneurs in the continents are women, yet they get 7% of funding. So let's get the math a little bit. We are heading into a finance COP. It's all about finance. Then we know that this continent gets only 4% of the funding. And out of 4%, there's only 7% getting to women. Women entrepreneurs that are really, the lung of the economy and the social breakthroughs. So I just wanted to put that in perspective, and how if we were taking, those really challenging some of the statistics and looking at some like what I've just said, the potential for scale, the potential to really just go further with partners like, who you have in this panel.
Thank you, Yamide. With the minute that we have left, let me jump to a lightning round question that Yamide just alluded to. We've got less than 2 months until COP29. Any hopes or dreams of what could and should emerge from this particular climate conference?
It's going to be a tough round. And it's been framed as there's a lot of decisions to really power to finance, the action that needs to be done. So I will just say, I would like the finance COP to become an investment COP, actually, because with finance, we either associate it to a lot of the cost of action, putting aside the cost of inaction, which is outweighing actually the cost of action. And it does have the sense of charity. It's about investing into the future. So even if it's going to be difficult, I think trying to make the connection to why we need that finance and the opportunities for a brighter, safer, future, and more also equitable future. So with the empowerment of women, I think this is what it is going to be about, and we will need to fight. I was happy to see a little bit of, at least honest conversation, creating space for honest conversation, even with ministers outside the negotiation, so that, people step back and they don't have the Damocles sword of their country's interest and position to really think a little bit more innovatively about ways forward, but connected to the reality. And if you remove the word climate finance, investment, maybe it brings something, a different mindset, because we know how to do this. Some of the investment, we need to stop finding some excuses. We know how to actually react for this. And we're entering for 12 months in a row for the first time in history. We passed 1.5. So 1.5 is still not out of the window, because you need about 20 years to try to see really the impact. But we are entering into uncharted territories, so let's accelerate and move from talk to action.
That's wonderful. The red light is yelling at us, but maybe in a word, do you have any expectations or hopes for COP29?
Well, I might, given the topic of the panel, with that it's around gender justice and climate justice, I think there's a lot that's happening, especially around COP30 and people coming together. So my hope is that we can collectively mobilize significant resources to actually support what we've talked about here, which is we know that there are organizations that are working on this at scale, making systems really shift in meaningful ways. So my hope is that collectively we can figure out how to support them in many of the ways that you were just describing.
When women are climate resilient, we will all be climate resilient.
All right. We have to leave it there. Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.